This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 433 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thank you for tuning in. Quarterback was decent last week aside from Andy Dalton, who looked pretty bad on Monday night. I missed Cam Akers too, thinking that Akers would get more work. That clearly didn't happen, and I'm never listening to Sean McVay again. And then my other big miss was probably JuJu Smith-Schuster. Now, I've been down on JuJu all year. I gave him a chance last week because I did like his matchup, but it flopped big time. More on him later. Things weren't all bad, though, last week on this show. I called out Trey Burton, who had a big day. Irv Smith was serviceable. The New York Giants and the Miami Dolphins defenses came through. Adrian Peterson found the end zone. There were some hits as well. I'd like to do better, but I'll give last week a 5 or 6 out of 10. Before looking at players I like more and less than the consensus this week, I wanted to let you know that FanDuel Sportsbook is giving you a chance to bet on the NFL this week risk-free with their exclusive same-game parlays. Simply place a 3-leg or more parlay on any NFL Week 7 game to be eligible for the offer, and follow along as the game unfolds. If you don't win your bet, FanDuel will refund your bet up to $10 in site credit. So definitely check that out at FanDuel Sportsbook. Must be 21 years or older and present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, West Virginia, Indiana, Colorado, or Iowa. Refund issued a non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 7 days. Max refund $10. Terms apply. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. In Indiana, call 1-800-9-WITH-IT. In Colorado, call 1-800-522-4700. In Iowa, call 1-800-BETS-OFF. Crushed it. Let's get to these matchups. I like Joe Burrow this week more than others. Or at least that's what it looks like. Cleveland ranks as the 12th best matchup for opposing quarterbacks in adjusted fantasy points allowed this year, which is only slightly worse than their unadjusted rating. The Bengals haven't been great at protecting Joe Burrow, but Cleveland's pressure rate is actually bottom 10 in the league despite the season that Myles Garrett is having. Burrow himself has been pretty strong for fantasy purposes, partially because of his scrambling ability. He scored at least 15 fantasy points in all but one game this year, with that one game coming against the Ravens. And based on his passing yardage total, he should actually have more touchdowns than he currently has, a lot more. He's one of the top regression candidates on the positive end across the league. That doesn't mean everything will overcorrect this week. Don't take that the wrong way. That's not how regression works. It just means that what we've seen so far from Burrow as his baseline, that might not be his baseline. So I like him this week. I also don't mind Teddy Bridgewater, who I talked about on the 15 Transactions episode earlier this week. I won't reiterate what I said on that show totally, but he's also a regression candidate who's really underperformed in touchdown rate this year. So we've got that going. We've got the idea that Teddy's baseline is probably better than what we've seen so far. And then there's also the matchup. New Orleans on the season ranks as the third most advantageous matchup for opposing quarterbacks in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. So Teddy is a very viable streamer. And I actually don't mind Baker Mayfield as a deeper play this week. I can't imagine a lot of you would have to start Baker, but just hear me out for a second. He's only really been bad fantasy-wise when he faced Baltimore and Pittsburgh, two teams that can get to the quarterback. Pittsburgh's first in pressure rate, Baltimore's third. Cincinnati is not that. They rank dead last in pressure rate, and according to Pro Football Focus, Baker hasn't been totally terrible when he's had a clean pocket this year. He ranks 18th in passer rating in clean pockets. That's ahead of guys like Kyler Murray, Matt Ryan, Lamar Jackson, Gardner Minshew, among many other quarterbacks. Aside from those games against Baltimore and Pittsburgh, so 4 games, Mayfield scored between 14 and 16 fantasy points. Cincinnati, on paper, is pretty average against quarterbacks. This game has an over-under north of 50 points, and it's projected to be close. So I would hope that I wouldn't have to start Mayfield, but this is not a terrible, terrible spot for him. Now, on the flip side, I'm a little bit lower on Tannehill this week than the consensus. Taylor Lewan is now out for Tennessee, and then they get Pittsburgh. I just mentioned this, but Pittsburgh as a team generates more pressure on opposing quarterbacks than any other team in football. So I'm just worried about how that Titans offensive line is going to hold up. And that's on top of the fact that Tannehill's looking at regression coming. And that's what I mentioned on the show earlier this week. I'm just a few spots lower than the consensus for Tannehill, where I think he's firmly a mid-range QB2 instead of a higher-end one. Antonio Gibson saw his usage drop from week 5 to week 6, going from a 92% running back rush share to a 43% one last week. Pretty tilting. So as a result, there's more risk involved with Gibson this week than there probably should be. But he's got a great matchup. We watched Kenyon Drake do work against Dallas last week, and the Cowboys rank as the 9th best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the running back position. I really just want to mention Gibson because even though his peripherals dropped, his snap share and his backfield share dropped, I'd still feel comfortable playing him this week given the matchup. And those peripheral numbers could easily just jump back up this week. I also think that you could use Joshua Kelley in a pinch. I would still be playing Justin Jackson over Kelley this week. But it's been a couple of tough matchups for Kelley, going up against Tampa Bay and New Orleans, 2 teams that can really stop the run. It shouldn't be as difficult against Jacksonville. The Jags rank as the 2nd best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. They face one of the lowest pass-to-rush ratios in football, so we could see a run-heavy script for the Chargers. And the Chargers are 7.5-point favorites. That's why we could see that script. Justin Jackson saw more work on the ground than Kelley the last time that we saw the Chargers. But we can't say for certain that that's how it's going to be week in and week out without Austin Eckler. I think we should be confident that Jackson sees more receiving volume, for sure. But Kelley could see more rushing work in any given week, especially if there's a positive game script. He's more of a bruiser, and we know that he's the goal line back. So I think that he's really underranked this week by analysts. And I think that Latavius Murray makes some sense if you're a little bit desperate this week too. Carolina's been atrocious against running backs all season long. Murray's seen 44% of New Orleans running back rushes this year. His target share is just 5%, but if there's a positive script for New Orleans, he could be involved. He's not a bad flex play. Now, Rex Burkhead keeps being ranked in like the low 30s over on Fantasy Pros each week, and I don't get it at all. That's why I keep bringing him up on this show. He continues to see very little receiving work with James White back. He saw a 2.9% target share the first week that White was back, and he didn't have a single target last week. So he has 1 target over his last 2 games. I don't know why you would play him this week over someone like Joshua Kelley, but he's ranked ahead of him. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that this is logical. I would not be playing Rex Burkhead. And the same goes for Jamal Williams. Williams over Kelley is kind of weird to me. The Packers could have a great offensive performance this week against Houston, and Williams has seen a spike in target share at times this year. Or at least he has 1 week. A few weeks ago, he had a 24% target share, but that was also somewhat of an anomaly. So while I get and I understand a sort of a deep play to get a piece of that Packers offense, you can play Jamal Williams. You can throw him into your lineup. I just don't think he should be as highly ranked as he is. I don't think I would be playing Jamal Williams over someone like Josh Kelley. I think Kelley has a much better floor. And then you could argue that he also has a better ceiling because he has more touchdown upside. He's the clear goal line back. Jamal Williams is not that. So while I don't mind Williams as sort of a dart throw, I'm kind of surprised by how high he's ranked this week. Like I said on yesterday's episode, T. Higgins has seen at least 20% of Cincinnati's targets in each of his last 4 games. I already mentioned how Burrow has a decent matchup, and Cleveland against wide receivers is the 2nd best matchup according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed method. You should be starting Higgins this week and probably every week moving forward. I also talked about Christian Kirk on yesterday's show and how we shouldn't let production cloud the peripherals, the lack of target share that he's seen this year. But it's hard for me to ignore the matchup this week. Among all wideouts with 20 or more targets this year, Kirk has the 4th highest average depth of target. Meanwhile, Seattle leads the NFL in percentage of targets allowed to wide receivers, where over 78% of targets against Seattle have gone to wideouts. And more importantly for Kirk's big play ability, Seattle's allowed the most 15-plus air yard completions per game this year. So even if Kirk's targets are limited, he has a shot to make another big play in this matchup. Now going further down this list, if you do want to get a piece of that Packers offense, you could go to Marquez Valdes-Scantling. No relevant player has a higher average depth of target this year than MVS. So a big play is always possible. But now he's facing a Texans secondary that ranks as an above average matchup, and it's in a game where the Packers have the highest implied total on this week's slate. MVS has also seen work. He has an 18.3% target share on the season, and without Allen Lazard over the last 2 weeks, that number's jumped to 20%. So a guy getting that volume in a high-scoring game who also sees his targets down the field, that's someone that I want to throw a dart at. Not physically, of course. Demarcus Robinson saw a 23% target share without Sammy Watkins last week, and he ran the most routes on that Chiefs team. He ran 34 routes versus Tyreek Hill's 33, Byron Pringle's 17, and Mecole Hardman's 13. That's according to Pro Football Focus. He's the Sammy Watkins replacement. So if Sammy's out again this week, I think he's absolutely in play against a Denver secondary that shouldn't be a big threat against this Chiefs offense. So the two wide receivers I want to talk about on the other side of things are two guys that I feel like I bring up almost every single week. I'm not sure how you start Michael Gallup right now, regardless of matchup. With Dalton under center in week 6, Gallup didn't see a hopeful boost in target share. Instead, it was just under 12%. And now on the season, his target share is just 12.1%. That type of target share is a little bit more meaningful because the Cowboys are pass heavy. But that pass heaviness may not come out this week because they're facing a bad Washington team. If they see a positive game script at all in that game, I would expect them to be more run heavy. They don't want to put the game in Dalton's hands. He's not Dak Prescott. So I'd absolutely leave Gallup on my bench this week. And then there's JuJu Smith-Schuster. JuJu now has the lowest average depth of target in the entire league right now among wideouts with 20 or more targets. He hasn't ranked higher than 27th in weekly scoring since his week 1 game where he scored a pair of touchdowns. And he's averaging just 4.7 PPR points per game over his last 2. And the Titans, who he's facing this week, have also been really good against the slot. No team has seen a smaller percentage of targets go to that area of the field than the Titans. So JuJu should not be ranked nearly as high as he's ranked this week, in my opinion at least. For most of you, he can be benched until we see more. It's really amazing to see how bad the tight end position is each and every week. If you need a streaming type this week, though, I've got 2 for you. I have very little confidence in both, but that's what you get at the position. Logan Thomas's peripherals have not gone away. They're still there. He ran the 3rd most routes in the league last week at tight end, and he came through with a score. Even though he had just a 10% target share, Thomas has a 17% target share on the season. That's a top 10 number at the position. So I think he's playable against Dallas. And if you want a true dart throw, I guess it's Richard Rodgers. I guess. There's no Zach Ertz. Doesn't sound like there's going to be Dallas Goedert. We know there are injuries to the wide receivers. Miles Sanders is out. So who's going to step up? Maybe it's the dad running Richard Rodgers, who ran 19 routes last week. He'll be the tight end 1 for Philly, it looks like, so he should be able to capture maybe 5 or 6 targets. That's not totally easy to find on the waiver wire. Speaking of that Philadelphia game, I think both defenses in that contest are very much in play this week. Philadelphia gets a New York team that's allowed a top 8 defensive performance in each one of their losses this year. We know Daniel Jones turns the ball over a lot. The Giants rank in the top 5 in pressure rate allowed. The game has a low over-under. The Eagles are slight favorites. Everything points to them having a strong outing. But don't ignore the Giants side either. Philly's banged up everywhere, including their offensive line, which should allow the Giants to get to Carson Wentz. Philly's allowed the most sacks in the league this year, and the Giants actually have an above-average pressure rate defensively. So they could have a good defensive outing for fantasy managers in back-to-back weeks. I think it's very possible. But since this is a Thursday night game, I'm totally prepared for a shootout. And I'm ready for people to listen to this podcast on Friday, hit my mentions and say, JJ, you're a moron. Wouldn't be the first time. But that's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. One more show this week, the mailbag episode that'll be out tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.